The Japanese military had cracked every American code they encountered during World War II. Every single one. Their cryptographers were some of the best in the world. But then something happened in 1942 that made their intercepted messages turn into complete nonsense. Random syllables, meaningless sounds. They had no idea what hit them. What the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans had just deployed the most unbreakable code in military history. And the crazy part, this code wasn't created by mathematicians or cryptography experts sitting in some government lab. It was created by a group of young Native American men from the Navajo Nation who used their own language as a weapon. A language so complex that even if you recorded it, even if you studied it for years, you still couldn't break it without being raised speaking it from birth. This is the story of how 29 Navajo men created a code that saved thousands of American lives and drove Japanese intelligence officers absolutely insane trying to crack it. Let me take you back to 1942. The United States was in serious trouble in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had just been attacked a few months earlier. American forces were getting pushed back across the Pacific Islands. And here's the thing that was making everything worse. The Japanese were intercepting and decoding American military communications almost as fast as Americans could send them. See, back then, military communication was a huge problem. You couldn't just pick up a cell phone and call headquarters. Radio was the main way to communicate across the Pacific Ocean, between islands, between ships, between ground forces and command. But radio signals could be intercepted by anyone listening on the right frequency, so everything had to be sent in code. The problem was that codes back then worked like puzzles. They were based on mathematics, patterns, substitution systems. You'd replace letters with numbers, or use cipher wheels, or follow complex algorithms. The thing about patterns is that if you're smart enough and you have enough time, you can figure them out. And the Japanese codebreakers were very smart and very patient. They had already broken multiple American codes. They knew American strategy. They could predict American movements. American Marines were walking into ambushes because the Japanese knew they were coming. Ships were getting torpedoed because enemy submarines knew exactly where they'd be. The death toll was climbing, and a big reason was that America couldn't communicate securely. The US military tried creating more complex codes. They tried changing codes more frequently. Nothing worked for long. The Japanese Imperial Army had teams of cryptographers working around the clock. Some of them had studied at American universities. They understood English, they understood American culture, they understood how American military minds worked, but there was one thing they didn't understand, and that was about to become their biggest nightmare. The idea for using Native American languages in warfare actually wasn't new. During World War I, the US Army had used Choctaw soldiers to send messages. The Germans intercepted these transmissions and had absolutely no clue what they were hearing. It worked beautifully, but after the war, the military kind of forgot about it. The idea just sat there unused for over 20 years. Then comes a guy named Philip Johnston. This is where the story gets interesting. Philip Johnston was a white guy, son of a missionary, who grew up on a Navajo reservation in Arizona. He was one of maybe fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the entire world who could speak the Navajo language fluently. And in early 1942, he read about military communication problems in the newspaper and had a light bulb moment. He knew the Navajo language was insanely complex. It's a tonal language, which means the same word can have completely different meanings based on the pitch and tone you use when saying it. Imagine trying to learn a language where the word ma could mean 4 different things, depending on whether your voice goes up or down, or stays flat when you say it. That's Navajo. But here's the kicker. Navajo had never been written down in any standardized way. There was no Navajo dictionary that could help you learn it. No textbooks, no phrasebooks. The only way to learn Navajo was to grow up in a Navajo community surrounded by native speakers from the time you were a baby. Even then, it took years to become fluent. Johnston went to the Marine Corps and pitched his idea. At first, they were skeptical. The Marines weren't exactly known for being open to unconventional ideas, but Johnston was persistent. He arranged a demonstration. He brought 4 Navajos to Camp Elliott in California and showed Marine officers what they could do. The demonstration was simple but impressive. The Marines gave Johnston a typical military message, something about troop movements and supply coordinates. Johnston gave the message to one Navajo man who translated it into Navajo and spoke it to another Navajo man in a different room via radio. That second man translated it back to English and wrote it down. The whole thing took seconds. The message was perfect, word for word. The Marine officers were stunned. This was faster than any code system they'd seen. No encoding time, no decoding time, no books or cipher wheels needed. Just 2 guys talking in their native language, and the Japanese would have 0 chance of understanding it. The Marines approved a pilot program. They recruited 29 young Navajo men to become the first code talkers. These guys were young. Most were teenagers or in their early 20s. Many of them had grown up on reservations where life was hard, where they'd faced poverty and discrimination their entire lives. Some had been forced to attend government boarding schools, where they were literally punished for speaking their own language. Think about that irony for a second. The US government had spent decades trying to erase Native American languages and cultures. Native kids were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where speaking their native language could get them beaten. The official policy was assimilation. Make them forget their native, make them act white, speak English only. And now suddenly, the government desperately needed that same language they'd tried to destroy. The 29 Navajo recruits reported to Camp Elliott and Marine Boot Camp. They went through the same brutal training every Marine went through, the same physical conditioning, the same weapons training, the same discipline. But then they got a special assignment that no other Marines had. They had to create a code based on their language. Here's where it gets technically fascinating. The Navajo men couldn't just speak Navajo and call it a day. Military communication has specific vocabulary. Words like bomber, submarine, grenade, tank. These are modern military terms that don't exist in Navajo, which is an ancient language developed by people who hunted and farmed in the American Southwest. So the code talkers had to invent new Navajo words for military terms, and they got creative. They used nature-based metaphors. A bomber became Jay-Show, which means buzzard in Navajo. A fighter plane became Da-He-Ti-Hi, hummingbird. A battleship became Lotso, whale. A submarine became Beshlo, ironfish. A grenade became Nimasi, potatoes, apparently because grenades kind of looked like potatoes. They created an entire military vocabulary using natural associations that made sense to Navajo speakers but would sound like complete gibberish to anyone else. A bombing run might be described as buzzards dropping potatoes from the sky. Good luck figuring that out if you're a Japanese cryptographer. But they didn't stop there. They also created an alphabet system for transmitting specific names or coordinates that couldn't be described with words. They needed to spell things out letter by letter. So they assigned Navajo words to each letter of the English alphabet based on the first letter of the English translation. For example, the letter A became Wolachi, the Navajo word for ant. The letter B became Shosh, bear. The letter C became Moasi, cat. If they needed to spell out a place name like Arizona, they'd say Wolachi, Klesh, Wolachi, Dze, Dibe, Yazi, Moasi, Tsa, Wolachi. Ant, ribbon, ant, nose, lamb, cat, needle, ant. This seems complicated, but remember, to a Navajo speaker, this was just vocabulary. They weren't doing complex mental mathematics like with traditional codes. They were just translating and talking. The speed was incredible compared to traditional encryption. And here's the genius part. They built redundancy into the system. They created multiple words for common letters to prevent pattern recognition. The letter E is the most common letter in English. So if you always used the same Navajo word for E, a clever cryptographer might eventually notice that word appearing frequently and figure out it represents E. So the code talkers created 3 different Navajo words that could represent E: Dze, elk; Aja, ear; and Ana, eye. They could rotate between them randomly. The 29 original code talkers spent weeks developing this system. They memorized everything because nothing could be written down. A written code book could be captured. They had to carry the entire code system in their heads. Every military term, every alphabet equivalent, every procedure. And they had to be able to use it under pressure, in combat, with explosions happening around them, with the chaos of war surrounding them. Then came the testing phase. The Marines gave them increasingly complex messages to transmit and translate. The code talkers performed flawlessly. They could encode, transmit, and decode messages faster than any mechanical cipher device. Where a traditional code might take 30 minutes to encrypt and transmit a message, the code talkers could do it in 20 seconds. The Marines were convinced. They authorized recruitment of more Navajo code talkers. Eventually, about 400 Navajo men would serve in the Pacific Theater during World War II, but those original 29 created the foundation that all the others would build on. The first major test of the Navajo Code came during the Battle of Guadalcanal in late 1942. This was one of the first major American offensives in the Pacific. The Marines were trying to take control of Guadalcanal Island from the Japanese. The fighting was brutal. Jungle warfare, extreme heat, malaria, supply shortages, constant Japanese counterattacks. The code talkers were spread out among different Marine units. They worked in pairs, usually communicating between different positions. When Marine commanders needed to call in artillery strikes or request reinforcements or report enemy positions, they used the code talkers to transmit the information. The Japanese were listening to everything. Their radio operators intercepted these transmissions like always, but this time what they heard made no sense whatsoever. It wasn't English being encrypted into mathematical patterns that could be analyzed. It wasn't even recognizable as any language they'd encountered. It was just streams of sounds that had no pattern, no structure they could identify. Japanese intelligence officers ordered their best cryptographers to work on these strange messages. They recorded the transmissions. They played them back at different speeds. They tried frequency analysis. They tried pattern recognition. Nothing worked. The messages were completely opaque. What the Japanese didn't realize was that they were trying to crack something that wasn't actually a code in the traditional sense. It was a language, and one of the hardest languages on Earth to learn. Even if they'd somehow figured out it was Navajo, which they didn't, they would have had virtually no way to learn it. There were no Navajo language resources they could access. No dictionaries, no grammar books, no recordings. And even if they'd found those resources, the military vocabulary was invented specifically for this purpose and existed nowhere else. The code talkers proved their worth immediately on Guadalcanal. Marines commanders were amazed at how fast and reliable the system was. Messages that used to take hours to encrypt and transmit were now being sent in minutes. And the best part, there wasn't a single documented case of the Japanese successfully decoding a Navajo Code Talker message during the entire war. After Guadalcanal, word spread through Marine Command about how effective these code talkers were. Every Marine division wanted them. The Marines recruited more Navajos. The Code Talkers participated in every major marine operation in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. Now let's talk about what was happening on the Japanese side, because this is where it gets darkly funny in a historical sense. Japanese military intelligence was absolutely losing their minds, trying to figure out what Americans were doing. They knew something had changed. Their code breaking had been working fine, and then suddenly, on certain radio frequencies, they were getting these bizarre transmissions that sounded like nothing they'd ever heard. At first, some Japanese officers thought it might be a technical problem with their radio equipment. Maybe American signals were getting corrupted during transmission. But no, the signals were clear. The problem was the content was incomprehensible. Then they thought maybe Americans had developed some kind of new mechanical encoding device. They sent intelligence reports back to Tokyo, describing this mysterious new code system. Cryptographers in Japan studied the recordings and were baffled. It didn't follow any rules of known codes. There was no mathematical pattern. It seemed almost random, but it was clearly structured communication, because American forces were responding to these messages with coordinated military actions. Some Japanese intelligence officers started to suspect it might be a language. But what language? It didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like any European language they knew. Some thought maybe it was a Pacific Island language. They questioned prisoners of war. They consulted with Japanese linguists who had studied various languages. Nobody could identify it. Here's an insane detail. At one point, the Japanese actually captured a Navajo soldier. This was not a code talker, just a regular Navajo Marine. The Japanese interrogators were excited because this prisoner clearly looked Native American. They had started to suspect Americans might be using a Native American language. They tried to get this Navajo prisoner to translate the code talker messages. They played him recordings of code talker transmissions. The prisoner listened and told them honestly that he couldn't understand it. The Japanese didn't believe him. They thought he was being defiant. They tortured him, trying to force him to translate. But here's the thing. He genuinely couldn't translate it. He spoke Navajo, yes, but he didn't know the military code vocabulary that the code talkers had invented. When he heard code talker messages, he could recognize that it was Navajo, but the specific words they were using, buzzards and potatoes and iron fish in military context, made no sense to him. It was like if someone spoke English to you, but all the nouns were replaced with random other nouns. You'd know it was English, but you wouldn't understand the meaning. The Japanese never figured it out. Even after the war, when American military records were being studied, it took years before the role of the Navajo Code Talkers became widely known. The code remained classified for a long time because the military thought they might want to use it again in future conflicts. The Code Talkers saw action in some of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War: Tarawa, Peleliu, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. These battles were horrific. The Japanese defended every island fanatically. They built bunkers and tunnels and fought to the death rather than surrender. American casualties were staggering. The Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945 is where the Code Talkers really showed their maximum value. This tiny island, just 8 square miles, became the site of one of the fiercest battles in Marine Corps history. The Japanese had built an elaborate system of underground tunnels and bunkers. They had artillery and machine guns positioned to cover every inch of beach. When Marines landed, they were immediately under intense fire. During the first 48 hours of the Battle of Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo Code Talker teams worked around the clock without sleep. They transmitted over 800 messages without a single error. Think about that. 800 complex military communications in the middle of combat with perfect accuracy. These weren't simple messages either. They were coordinating artillery barrages, calling in naval bombardment from ships offshore, directing airstrikes, reporting enemy positions, requesting medical evacuations, organizing ammunition resupply. Every aspect of Marine operations flowed through Code Talker communications. A Marine officer named Major Howard Connor, who was a signal officer at Iwo Jima, later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." That's a massive statement. Iwo Jima was strategically critical. It gave Americans an airbase within striking distance of mainland Japan. The Code Talkers were integral to winning that battle. The Code Talkers operated in incredibly dangerous conditions. They weren't sitting safely behind the lines. They were right up front with the combat units. They had to be close to the commanders who needed to send messages. This meant they were under fire constantly. They were in foxholes during artillery bombardments. They were on beaches during amphibious assaults. 13 Code Talkers were killed in action during the war. Many more were wounded. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. These Navajo men faced racism from some of their fellow Marines. Remember, this was the 1940s in America. Segregation was still legal. Native Americans faced enormous discrimination. Some Marines didn't trust the Code Talkers at first, just because they looked different, spoke a different language, had different cultural backgrounds. There are stories of Code Talkers being mistaken for Japanese soldiers by American troops who didn't know about the Code Talker program. Some Code Talkers had to be assigned bodyguards not to protect them from the enemy, but to protect them from potentially being shot by confused American soldiers who saw an Asian-looking face and assumed enemy. Despite all this, the Code Talkers performed brilliantly. They earned the respect of the Marines they served with through their actions, their courage, their reliability. Marines who initially were skeptical became fierce defenders of their Code Talkers. The bond that formed between Code Talkers and their Marine units was incredibly strong. Let's get into why the Navajo Code was so technically superior to every other code system, because this is genuinely fascinating from a cryptography perspective. Traditional military codes during World War II relied on substitution and transposition. You'd substitute letters for numbers or rearrange letter order according to a mathematical formula. The famous Enigma machine used by Nazi Germany was basically an incredibly complex substitution cipher. But here's the fundamental problem with all mathematical codes. They create patterns, and patterns can be analyzed. Cryptographers use something called frequency analysis. In English, certain letters appear more often than others. The letter E appears in about 13% of all English text. If you intercept enough encoded messages, you can start to notice which encoded symbol appears most frequently, and you can guess that probably represents E. From there, you can start working out other common letters and words. With enough messages and enough time, you can break most mathematical codes. The Germans thought Enigma was unbreakable because it had millions of possible settings, but British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, including Alan Turing, figured out ways to break it by exploiting patterns and mistakes. The Japanese codes were similarly breakable because they followed mathematical rules. The Navajo Code was different because it wasn't based on mathematics. It was based on linguistic knowledge. There was no pattern to analyze because the pattern was the entire structure of the Navajo language itself. All the grammar, all the syntax, all the tonal variations, all the cultural context. Even if Japanese cryptographers had somehow figured out they were hearing Navajo, which they never did, they would have needed to first learn Navajo itself. And remember, Navajo is what linguists call a sleeping language, or an unwritten language at that time. You can't just buy a Navajo textbook and study it. You have to learn it from native speakers over many years. And even if they'd managed that impossible task, they still wouldn't understand the military vocabulary because that was invented by the Code Talkers and didn't exist in regular Navajo. You'd have to somehow capture a code talker alive and get him to explain the entire system, which never happened. The security of the code was also helped by operational security. The code talkers were under strict orders not to discuss their work. They couldn't tell family members what they did. After the war, the code remained classified for decades, so even if Japanese intelligence had tried to research Navajo after the war, they would have found no information connecting Navajo to military communications. From a pure cryptography standpoint, the Navajo Code represents something unique in military history, an absolutely unbreakable code based not on mathematical complexity, but on linguistic isolation. It's one of the only codes ever used in warfare that enemy forces never even came close to breaking. The code talkers didn't have an easy life in the military. Training was intense. Marine boot camp was designed to break down recruits and rebuild them as Marines. The code talkers went through the same hell every Marine experienced: forced marches, obstacle courses, weapons training, combat drills, screaming drill instructors. On top of that, they had to memorize the entire code system. This wasn't something they could write down and study. It all had to be in their heads. They had to be able to recall instantly the Navajo word for any military term, any letter, any procedure. They practiced constantly, sending messages back and forth, getting faster and more accurate. When they deployed to the Pacific, conditions were miserable. The Pacific Islands were hot and humid. Diseases like malaria and dysentery were common. Food supplies were often limited. Marines lived in foxholes and tents. They dealt with insects, snakes, tropical storms. Combat was terrifying. The Japanese were skilled fighters who used camouflage and ambush tactics. The code talkers carried the same equipment as other Marines: rifles, ammunition, grenades, backpacks. But they also carried radio equipment, which was heavy and bulky in the 1940s. The radios they used weighed about 30 pounds. Try running across a beach under enemy fire while carrying a 30-pound radio on your back. They had to set up communications quickly under pressure. When Marines landed on a beach, the code talkers had to get their radios operational immediately so commanders could start coordinating operations. This often meant setting up antennas while bullets were flying overhead. The mental stress was intense too. The code talkers knew that mistakes could cost lives. If they mistranslated a message about artillery coordinates, American shells might land on American troops. If they garbled a message about enemy positions, Marines might walk into an ambush. The pressure to be perfect every single time in the middle of combat chaos was enormous. And they weren't just translating words, they had to understand military context. They needed to know enough about tactics and operations to ensure their translations made sense. If a commander said, "We need artillery support on the ridge at coordinates XY," the code talker had to understand what that meant tactically, so they could translate it accurately in a way that the receiving code talker would understand and translate back properly. Many code talkers described feeling split between two worlds. In Navajo culture, warriors held a special place. Fighting for the tribe was honorable, but Navajo spiritual beliefs also emphasized harmony and balance. The violence of war conflicted with traditional teachings. Some code talkers struggled with this internal conflict. They also dealt with survivors' guilt after the war. They had seen friends killed. They had survived battles where many others didn't. Some developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, though that term didn't exist then. They came home to reservations where life was still difficult, where opportunities were limited, where discrimination continued. After World War II ended, the code talkers came home. Unlike other veterans who were celebrated with parades and public recognition, the code talkers returned quietly. Their contribution remained classified. They couldn't talk about what they'd done. Their families often didn't know the role they'd played in winning the war. This secrecy lasted for decades. It wasn't until 1968, 23 years after the war ended, that the Navajo Code was finally declassified. Even then, public recognition came slowly. Many code talkers had already died by the time their story became widely known. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th National Code Talkers Day. In 2001, the original 29 code talkers were awarded Congressional Gold Medals, the highest civilian honor Congress can give. Only 5 of the original 29 were still alive to receive their medals in person. The recognition, while meaningful, came very late. Most code talkers lived their post-war lives in relative obscurity. They worked regular jobs on reservations, raised families, lived quiet lives. They'd helped win one of the biggest wars in human history, but hardly anyone knew it. The irony is painful. These men had used their language, a language the US government had tried to erase to save American lives and help win a war. They'd proven the value of Native American culture and language. Yet they returned to reservations where poverty and discrimination remained harsh realities. The government that desperately needed their language in wartime continued policies that marginalized Native communities in peacetime. Some code talkers became activists after the war, fighting for Native American rights and recognition. They used their status as veterans to advocate for their communities. Others simply wanted to live peaceful lives after experiencing the horror of war. The legacy of the code talkers extends beyond World War II. Their success proved that Native American languages and cultures had practical value, not just historical or cultural significance. This helped shift some attitudes about Native American education and language preservation. Today, efforts to preserve and revitalize Native American languages often point to the code talkers as an example of why these languages matter. The Navajo language is now taught in schools on the Navajo Nation. There are Navajo language programs and resources that didn't exist in the 1940s. The code talkers also inspired similar programs in later conflicts. During the Vietnam War, the US military used Native American soldiers speaking various native languages for secure communications. The precedent set by the Navajo Code Talkers showed that indigenous languages could be valuable military assets. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers reveals something important about warfare and technology. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution isn't the most complex one. The US military had access to advanced mechanical cipher machines, to mathematicians and engineers working on encryption technology. But the most secure communication system they used was a human language spoken by a small Native American tribe. This highlights a principle that cryptographers understand. The security of a code depends not on how complex it is, but on how difficult it is to break without the key. The Navajo Code's key was the entire Navajo language and culture, something that couldn't be stolen or calculated or discovered through mathematical analysis. The Code Talkers also represent an interesting case study in respecting indigenous knowledge and culture. The US government's treatment of Native Americans had been historically terrible. Forced relocation, cultural suppression, broken treaties, systematic discrimination. But when the military needed help, it was Native Americans who provided an asset no one else could. This raises questions about how societies value different types of knowledge. Western education tends to prioritize written languages, mathematical systems, documented information. But oral traditions and unwritten languages have their own strengths. The Navajo language's complexity, which made it hard to learn from books, was exactly what made it perfect for secure military communications. The Code Talkers' success also challenged racial stereotypes prevalent in the 1940s. At a time when Native Americans were widely viewed by white Americans as primitive or backward, these Navajo men demonstrated intelligence, bravery, and technical skill that proved equal or superior to anyone else. They earned the respect of the Marines they served alongside through their actions. Behind the military history are individual human stories that deserve attention. Each code talker had their own journey, their own motivations for serving, their own experiences of war. Some enlisted because they wanted to fight for America despite the discrimination they faced. They believed in defending their country even when their country didn't always defend them. Others enlisted for adventure or economic opportunity or to escape difficult situations on reservations. Many code talkers were incredibly young when they enlisted. Some were just 17 or 18 years old. They went from reservation life directly into Marine boot camp and then into some of the most intense combat of World War II. They experienced trauma and violence that would mark them for life. There are stories of code talkers showing incredible courage under fire. One code talker continued transmitting messages even after being wounded. Another set up communications equipment while under sniper fire. They weren't just communications specialists, they were Marines who fought when necessary. After the war, many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Combat had changed them. They'd seen things they couldn't talk about, both because of classification and because of trauma. Some turned to alcohol. Some isolated themselves. Mental health support was virtually non-existent, especially for Native Americans on reservations. Others found ways to process their experiences through traditional Navajo ceremonies. Navajo culture has specific healing rituals for warriors returning from battle. These ceremonies helped some code talkers deal with the psychological wounds of war in ways Western medicine didn't address. Family members of code talkers often describe them as humble men who didn't seek attention or glory. They'd done their duty, survived, and wanted to move on with life. The classification of their work made this easier in some ways. They literally couldn't talk about it, even if they'd wanted to. When the code was finally declassified and recognition came, it meant different things to different code talkers. Some were proud to finally share their story. Others felt it was too late, that recognition should have come when they were younger. Some were happy their families could finally understand what they'd done during the war. Let's get into more specific details about how the code actually worked in practice, because the system was more sophisticated than just speaking Navajo. The code had two distinct parts. The first part was the alphabet system I mentioned earlier, used for spelling out names, places, and technical terms that didn't have Navajo equivalents. But remember, they created multiple Navajo words for each letter to prevent frequency analysis. For common letters that appear frequently in English, they had 3 different Navajo words that could represent that letter. For less common letters, they might have just one word. This means the code talkers had to memorize not just 26 words for the alphabet, but over 40 words because of the alternates. When spelling something out, the code talker would randomly choose which alternate to use for repeated letters. So spelling attack might use different words for the 2 T's and the 2 A's. This randomization prevented any pattern recognition. The second part of the code was the military vocabulary, all those terms for weapons, vehicles, tactics, positions. This vocabulary kept expanding during the war. The original 29 code talkers created about 400 military terms initially. As the war went on and new weapons and tactics emerged, code talkers in the field would create new terms and share them with other code talkers. For example, when new types of aircraft were introduced, the code talkers would invent new Navajo names for them using their nature-based system. New weapons got new names. New tactical concepts got new descriptions. The code was a living, evolving language system. The Code Talkers also developed shortcuts and procedures for common military communications. If a commander needed to call in artillery fire, there was a standard format for that message: target location, type of fire requested, adjustments needed. The Code Talkers knew these formats so well they could translate them almost instantly. Accuracy was enforced through strict protocols. Messages were typically sent twice to confirm. The receiving Code Talker would repeat back the message to verify he'd understood correctly. If there was any doubt, they'd spell out questionable words using the alphabet system. The Code Talkers worked in teams. Usually, there would be one Code Talker with a forward commander and another Code Talker at headquarters or another unit. They'd communicate back and forth constantly during operations. The relationship between paired Code Talkers was critical. They had to trust each other completely. During major battles, multiple Code Talker teams would be operating simultaneously on different radio frequencies, coordinating different aspects of the operation. At Iwo Jima, 6 Code Talker teams were working around the clock. Each team was handling different types of communications, one team coordinating artillery, another coordinating air support, another handling logistics, etc. The radios they used had limited range. On a typical day, a radio might reliably transmit about 5 miles. In bad weather or rough terrain, the range could drop to just a couple miles. This meant Code Talkers had to be positioned strategically to maintain communications across the battlefield. They also had to deal with radio equipment failures. The radios were sturdy but not indestructible. They could get damaged by water, sand, explosions, or just heavy use. Code Talkers had to know basic radio repair and maintenance. If the radio died during combat, they had to fix it quickly or find another way to communicate. It's worth emphasizing again just how completely the Navajo Code stumped Japanese intelligence, because this is remarkable in military history. Japan had excellent cryptographers. They'd broken British codes, American codes, Chinese codes. They had experience with various languages. Japanese intelligence officers spoke English, Chinese, various Southeast Asian languages. They had resources. They could dedicate teams of people to work on this problem. They recorded transmissions and studied them. They tried every technique they knew, and they got absolutely nowhere. After the war, when American occupation forces were in Japan and going through Japanese military archives, they found reports about the mysterious American Code. Japanese intelligence officers had written detailed analyses trying to figure out what Americans were doing. Their conclusions were hilariously wrong. Some thought it was a mechanical device creating random noise. Others thought it was some kind of artificial language invented by American cryptographers. One analysis suggested Americans might be using a combination of multiple different codes simultaneously. None of them came close to guessing it was a Native American language. There's a documented case of a Japanese intelligence officer writing a report that said, essentially, "We have concluded that breaking this American code system is impossible with available resources and techniques." That's a stunning admission from military intelligence, that they'd encountered something they simply couldn't crack. This had real strategic consequences for Japan. Not being able to intercept American communications meant they couldn't predict American movements and plans. They lost the intelligence advantage they'd had earlier in the war. This forced them to be more reactive, more defensive, less able to set up the kind of ambushes and counters they'd used effectively in 1941 and early 1942. Some military historians argue that the Navajo Code contributed to the overall Allied victory in the Pacific by denying Japan critical intelligence. It's hard to quantify exactly how many lives were saved or how many battles were won because of secure communications, but it's clear that being able to coordinate operations without the enemy knowing your plans gave Americans a significant advantage. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is ultimately about unintended consequences and historical irony. The US government spent decades trying to suppress Native American languages and cultures. Native children were forced into boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their native languages. The goal was assimilation, to make Native Americans give up their identity and become culturally white. But when America needed an unbreakable code, it was one of those supposedly primitive languages that provided the solution. The complexity and uniqueness of Navajo, traits that made it difficult to learn from books and therefore useless in a written language-dominated world, were exactly what made it perfect for secure military communications. The Navajo Code Talkers served with distinction in one of the most brutal theaters of World War II. They participated in every major Marine operation in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. They transmitted thousands of messages without error. They earned the respect of the Marines they served alongside. 13 of them died in combat. Many more were wounded physically and psychologically, and for decades almost nobody knew about it. Their contribution was classified. They couldn't share their story. When recognition finally came, many of the Code Talkers had already passed away. The 5 surviving members of the original 29 who received Congressional Gold Medals in 2001 were elderly men finally receiving acknowledgement for something they'd done 60 years earlier. The last of the original 29 Code Talkers, Chester Nez, died in 2014 at age 93. The last surviving Code Talker from the entire program, Thomas Begay, died in 2024 at age 98. Their generation is now gone, but their legacy remains. They proved that Native American languages and cultures have value, not just historical or cultural value, but practical value that can literally change the course of history. They showed that sometimes the most effective solution to a modern problem isn't more technology or more complexity, but rather drawing on traditional knowledge and linguistic diversity. The Navajo Code remains one of the only military codes in history that was never broken by enemy forces. Not during the war, not after. It stands as a testament to the ingenuity of those 29 young Navajo men who created it and the 400 Code Talkers who used it in combat. Their story is a reminder that we should value and preserve linguistic and cultural diversity, not just for sentimental reasons, but because we never know when that diversity might prove essential. The Navajo language, which government policy tried to erase, ended up helping save American democracy from fascism. That's one hell of an irony, and one hell of a legacy. Check out the next video where I break down another incredible story from World War II that most people have never heard about.